Hello, I'm Essraa Nawar. Welcome to the Information Gone Wild podcast brought to you by the San José State University iSchool.
I'm Maurice Coleman. On this podcast, we discuss all things library and information science.
And I'm Paul Signorelli, your third host, because we can count one, two, three, and here we are. We're delighted today to have John Chrastka from EveryLibrary as our subject of interviewee and subject of wisdom. John's a longtime colleague and friend. I learned a lot from him, and I'm hoping that all of you are going to learn from him today as he talks about how he's put together this organization, a nonprofit that is helping public school and college libraries win funding at the ballot box, and it works to ensure funding and access to libraries for generations to come.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It's a real treat to be on the podcast, but also with the SJSU community too. We're big fans and collaboration partners.
John, can you give us a little background on you, on how you got into doing this kind of work? And then I want to throw you a softball question that we like to ask all of our guests. What brings you happiness?
So I got started with EveryLibrary 13 years ago as a co-founder, along with our colleagues Patrick Sweeney and Erica Finley, on this as a gap filler. When you get right down to it, EveryLibrary, the political action committee for libraries, a few years later opened up the EveryLibrary Institute as a public policy, tax policy, and education policy think tank. Got started in EveryLibrary because I accidentally came to really enjoy libraries after having worked at the American Library Association and having been a trustee at my local library in Berwyn, Illinois, my hometown, as a trustee for a couple of the statewide systems in Illinois. I was not a library person coming into that job at the ALA. I was a publishing and bookselling person. Started off like all theater majors in college do, needing an actual job. So I went to work at a bookstore, got recruited by a publishing company, set up an online trade group back when the internet was pretty new, and then did some ed tech. Like most .coms back in the ed tech days, it kind of collapsed in 2002, 2001. And my wife said, "That's enough of that. It's my turn." And she went to grad school to do public health, which is a great career and vocation. And we needed a job that had insurance, and it was either work for the ALA or work for Barnes and Noble. And I almost flipped a coin and went with the ALA and came to really love this industry. The chance to be able to work on something that is systems focused. I'm not a librarian. I don't have an MLS. I don't pretend to be a librarian. But to support librarians and libraries as institutions, to spend time working on the funding formula now. EveryLibrary, we set it up as, again, a gap filler. There was a lot of focus over the years from great national organizations on the profession, how to be a better librarian. What we really saw from the data that came out of the OCLC From Awareness to Funding Study 2008, the first one was that if we don't pay attention to the political conversations that are happening amongst voters and constituents of elected officials, we will lose ground. And then as we moved into the 2018 From Awareness to Funding survey as well, we saw that the things were eroding, which is one of the reasons that we set up the Public Policy Tax Policy Institute, because other national organizations, state library associations talk about how to be better librarians. What we were trying to do was to help them be better politicians in a certain respect. Where does money come from? How do you get more of it? And that has been good work. We've done over 140 election days for libraries. We've done hundreds of negotiations and lobbying activities with city councils and county governments. We support 17 different state library associations right now with their legislative portfolios. It's where the ideas about librarianship move from the hope-filled to perhaps having enough revenue to do it. Oh, and then what brings me happiness? So that's a really nice question, because I got asked on a podcast a couple months ago by somebody who was a little younger, than you are, Maurice, about what my self-care regime was. Okay. And I said, self-care, more work. That's like, that's one thing. That's where it's at. The joyful part of the work is, this is going to sound really funny perhaps, because you'd expect me to say winning. I do like the win, but I actually enjoy when we can help people lose better. Like, those are the campaigns where it's not going to go this time, but we went out and did the fight. We built the right infrastructure. We did coalition work. We helped train, support, and coach the leadership teams. They're better off for having us in their lives a little bit.
Mhm.
I love the win, but it's the iterative approach to helping upskill groups of humans that really brings me some joy.
What about when you take off the executive director hat? You're just John.
Smoking meat. The
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, all men of a certain age either have to make a decision to be really into the World War II lore or get into smoking meat, and I went with smoking meat.
That's
Okay.
That's a hard one to do a follow-up to. I'm going to default to what you said just before that, talking about that sense of helping people when they lose as well as when they win. It strikes me as I work with you and your colleagues at EveryLibrary, it strikes me as I look at your website that it's both a community and a resource for all of us. I'm wondering, with that in mind, if you can talk a little bit about the website and give people that are unfamiliar with it a run through of the kind of things you're going to find there that will help them to be better as advocates in their field.
Sure. So we have two corporate entities. I mentioned EveryLibrary and the EveryLibrary Institute. Those are separate organizations. They're independent organizations. There are a couple of board members who are in common, and they're mission aligned. You'll see when you come to the website, everylibrary.org, which is our main conversation piece around political action. Then you'll find EveryLibrary Institute, which is where our research is hosted, where there's public policy conversations, some statements, things like amicus briefs. We want to have the thoughtful engagement with the ideas, including our journal too. We have a journal called the Political Librarian, which is intended to develop scholarship on these matters. So between EveryLibrary as how do we put ideas into action, and then EveryLibrary Institute is how do we ripen those ideas. We look at it almost as the difference between a doctor's practice, where you have one patient at a time, we got one library at a time. We have a practice, so we got a bunch of libraries that we work with over here. Medically, what are their symptoms? How do we help them get better? And then we've got our institute side, which is like our public health side. Like, you can work on one patient's cancer, but maybe you can outlaw smoking. So those are the kind of resources you find across those two sites. We have our action site, action.everylibrary.org, which is where we operationalize our calls to action, both for ourselves and for our partners, as well as the saveschoollibrarians.org site, which is operationalizing those calls to action around schools, funding for school library collections and staff. And then our Fight for the First site, fightforthefirst.org, which is our anti-censorship, anti-discrimination platform. We don't, with all the crises going on around censorship and discrimination campaigns, we needed to have a very rapid way to onboard problems at the zip code level, at the school district level. So we basically built change.org just for libraries. And then we also have our Fund Libraries site, which is our crowdfunding, nonprofit crowdfunding site, because we like to help new ideas fledge.
I like how you explained it, John. And I mean, as you're speaking, I'm thinking, wow, you made it happen. A lot of people, whether in the library world or in any other industries, they have ideas for either nonprofits or organizations, or they want to leave their current job, just like you did at leaving ALA and starting your dream, right? But I'm sure this has been going on for almost 14 years, since 2012. But what kind of challenges, right? Like in those 12 years that you faced to actually make this organization happen, maybe a couple of stories?
Absolutely. So the one thing, just for clarity's sake, is I left ALA for personal reasons and professional reasons. And there was a break for a couple of years where I did association management consulting before I came back into libraries to start EveryLibrary. And that break time was interesting because I went out and thought to myself, I could be an association management professional. And I could help as a consultant, help the Academy of Chest Physicians, the Cremation Society in North America. I met 4 out of the 5 dentists actually doing some consulting. It was pretty cool. And I hated it. I absolutely hated it because you had a good idea, and you'd have to be the CEO of the organization, the president of the organization, the chair of the committee at the same time, in order to get anything done. And I didn't like doing association management consulting. So I set up an organization where I could be the president, the CEO, and the chair of the committee at the same time. It made things move a little faster. The challenges have been, it's a couple of iterative challenges. One is that, who the hell are you? is a real interesting thing to try and answer. Why do you think that you can? What you have to do in terms of showing up with integrity, showing up
Mhm.
with data behind, what you're trying to accomplish, and listening helps obviate that challenge. There is a funder conversation that has to happen for any donor-supported organization. We have donors who support our work, either small donors, kind of the Bernie Sanders model, where it's $5 here, $50 there. We have philanthropy that supports us, family foundations and other donor-advised kinds of frameworks, which is great to have. We
Mhm.
also do some consulting services for some state libraries and training programs as well. So we've diversified our revenue over the years. But that revenue, how do you pay good, smart people who know what they're doing for their time? And so the challenge about saying, how do we use money in an unusual way? It was certainly something we had to address. We were the first, and we still are, the National Political Action Committee for Libraries. And a 501c4 is a different part of the tax code than a 501c3, which is what all the associations are, all the charitable organizations are, all of the foundations are all C3s. We said we want to use money in a different way. And there was a lot
Mhm.
of education that had to go on for the profession about how something like a dark money super PAC for libraries, we're actually on your side. It's not like nefarious money that's happening in other places. And then the third big challenge is one around what we had to figure out was why us, and it's an internal challenge. Like why us in this kind of a space? When somebody calls and says we have a problem or we have an opportunity that we want to pursue, or we see
Mhm.
something happening in the newspaper and we're like, oh my God, the world's on fire over there. So we had to come up with a rubric around why do we get involved and when don't we get involved? And that challenge of making sure that we are showing up, what we try and do is identify the local legitimate stakeholder. It might be the board of trustees for the library saying they want to go out for a ballot measure. It might be the school librarian whose job is under threat. It might be the integrity of the readers when there's a censorship activity.
Mhm.
We try and focus on the affected populations, either in a positive or negative context. To a positive context, we're going to build a new building. The affected population in that community is going to benefit. A negative situation, like, again, censorship or book bans, where those stories are going to be erased. And then we do ask that the strong question about whether or not we're going to make any difference at all. Because in politics, sometimes things are possible to do, and you just got to get it done right. Sometimes things are impossible. They feel really difficult. It's almost, oh, we're never going to get this done. Yeah, maybe let's change the world a little bit. We can figure out how to do it. But then in politics, there's a third state of being, which is it's impossible to do it. Sometimes it's that can we actually affect any change, or are we in it for some reason that is? I don't want to do. I'm not trying to do every library promotional activity, but the fact that we show up and write a strongly worded letter.
Can I ask you just a very quick follow-up question?
Sure.
Did you ever face any criticism that you're not a librarian, that you don't have an MLIS? And I have a reason for why I'm asking that.
Yeah. So my answer is I don't think that the practice or the praxis or the competencies that we're trying to deliver are librarianship in its most traditional. Certain programs, including our hosts, have a lot more advocacy focus. But you count down from two or three or four of the library schools, the other 50 some accredited ones don't do it very much. So I'm not here to teach librarianship. I'm here to teach something else. And then from a more serious perspective, I don't tell them how to run their library. That is outside of my zone. That's outside of my wheelhouse as well. I've been a trustee for a library. That's fiduciary and policy. That's not day-to-day praxis.
Fair enough.
So what's your reason for asking that, though?
Well, the reason is, the library world is changing so much, and I was in Dubai just a few weeks ago at a Future of Libraries conference, and there was a debate whether or not you need to have an MLIS degree or not. So, is it the skill or the practice? I've been just thinking, what would people think about the work that you're doing without the degree? But thanks for the answer. I mean, it's always intriguing to discuss with people, their purpose of why or why not they're getting an MLIS.
I'm a big fan of a job description that has clarity of purpose, and it also has the right kind of requirements attached to it. There are very, very many jobs in libraries and archives and even museums that an MLS is germane for. But there's also jobs in libraries that it's not. I mean, if you're going to run a bookmobile, you need a CDL. You don't need an MLS, you
Right.
know?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So, John, what advice would you offer students and your peers who are dreaming about starting a new organization to fill an unmet need in the information field?
So form follows function is a very tried and true pithy phrase that people knock around when they're having, conversations in their dorm room in college, Form follows function is true though. That it's very important in setting up an organization is to figure out the structure of it legally and financially in order to empower you to do the work. There's a lot more out there than a 501c3, and there's a lot more ways to bring in revenue. Now, especially with things like Patron and those kinds of more individual or group supports, there's pathways to have a mission-driven organization where you have fiscal sponsorships, where you don't have to set up your own structure, in order to bring in grant money. The form follows function stuff says, what do you want to accomplish? And then what's the legal and financial structure? Likewise, the governance structure. We set up EveryLibrary as a 501c4 political action committee because we wanted to put money to work and ideas to work in a political space where you have to spend money to do it. You're influencing the outcome of elections. That's unavailable activity for C3s. So the form of the organization is how do we want to function? And so agnostically about what the idea is out in the world, does it have to look like the last idea? Does it have to look like a legacy idea in order for it to be successful? Maybe it does. I'm not poo-pooing any of that. But do you need a board that is, or do you need committees? Do you need all that kind of infrastructure? Or can you be a leaner type organization or an alternative within the law, for nonprofit corporations or even for-profit corporations? I mean, that whole B Corp thing is something that isn't really well traveled right now in libraries, but it could be.
What is an LB, John?
I'm sorry, a B corporation, a benefit corporation. It's one that's a for-profit that has in its corporate charter the requirement to give a certain percentage of their gross revenue away.
Okay.
And to a charitable purpose. There's social enterprises. Maurice, there's a whole part of the tax code called the 501c7 that I would love to explore with somebody. It's when you can set up a social club. And you can, you can have your own liquor license, and you can have gambling and that kind of stuff. I think that there's a place for that.
Liquor license in libraries, Look, support your local library with a little bit of booze. Okay, that's different. That's different.
Yeah. John, let's go with that a little bit. Let's be creative here. Our students are trying to figure out what kind of world they're moving into, and our peers are asking the same question. If we were to go down that road, what are some of the dreams you see that libraries might pursue and the advocates supporting them would pursue in terms of that 7 status you were just talking about?
Well, so we've explored the C7 status because every library tries to host good parties, so I thought, okay, maybe if we put it into a C7 framework and we can actually bring it in as revenue that wouldn't be taxed because of the way the tax code. I mean, fundamentally, Paul, it's a situation where let's say that you are looking to permanently at a county level, okay, you've got a county library system and your county's growing like crazy. You know that over the next 20 years, you have to build 4 more libraries or you have to lease 4 more libraries. Could we set up a business unit within that library foundation, for example, where the foundation becomes the landlord? They basically become McDonald's. They buy the land, they build the library, and they lease it back to the library in the public trust. Like these are areas that have been explored outside of libraries before, either in the for-profit or the nonprofit sector, that have never been really traveled in our space. They could provide tremendous leverage to that system, and they could fundamentally alter the instability quotient that's in libraries. That's something I've been, am I kicking it around? No. If I had 13 lives to lead, it'd probably be the 14th one I'd do. But the idea of that, if there's a problem out there, looking inside libraries for that solution is the first place I would look. And we're not trying to disrupt librarianship with EveryLibrary, but if librarianship does need to be disrupted, you might have to look outside. The way that early childhood funding moves and the authority around early childhood, both the conversations around center-based and home-based early child care centers and the policy framework. I mean, you've got funders out there like the Annie Casey Foundation that have done the research like our institute hopes to do. You've got political action groups out there. You've got now most states, they've got an office for early childhood. And yes, we have a legacy state library system that goes back to the Jefferson era, in some states. But what are you trying to disrupt? And are there examples from outside of our industry as well that you look at? I think so.
It's such great advice. You bring back to mind one of our former state librarians here in California, probably taught me the best lesson I ever got outside of a classroom. Said, if you want to be a better librarian, go in. This was a time when, of course, we'd walk into stores and there'd be rack after rack of magazines. So go to a section of magazines that you don't normally read and pick up one of those and open your eyes up to what's going on elsewhere. And I hear you saying to us and to our students and our peers, go look at those other magazine racks, look at those other models, because that's where the future lies for us.
It very well could. The entrepreneurial spirit behind innovation doesn't have to be for profit. Government has a huge role in people's lives. I mean, education, public libraries, archives, the museum system, like the role of government, the role of a taxation-driven or a taxation-based entity in helping people achieve who they want to be is the we the people, the general welfare stuff that's in the Constitution. And there's a lot of different ways forward to support that general welfare.
John, I want to take you to the books that you and your colleague Patrick Sweeney have written. I looked at the publication date. They're 2017 and 2019, and just allow me to read their titles really quick. The 2017 book is Winning Elections and Influencing Politicians for Library Funding. The other one is Before the Ballot, Building Political Support for Library Funding. I know I've taken a look at one of them at some point in my life. That's why I'm really excited to be with you today and learn from you firsthand. But as far as I understand, they're some of the best books on library advocacy in recent times. But the last one was published in 2019. So what have changed in library advocacy since then? What are your recommendations?
Sure. So I want to give my colleague and co-writer, Patrick, a big shout out for the first book, The Winning Elections and Influencing Politicians for Library Funding. And by the way, Patrick is, for the permanent record, a adjunct at SJSU, as you know. But I want to make sure I give him a shout out. He does a class every the January through April term, I believe, on library advocacy, where the practical application of those ideas comes into force. And then I was the principal on the Before the Ballot. And the difference between those two books is that the first one, The Winning Elections and Influencing Politicians, is about how do you create networked organizations, network effect organizations that are aligned around mission, vision, and value system to build coalition in your communities and advance an agenda. It's principles of how to do that. The practical application is going to be different in every zip code that a library is in. But that idea that says, how do we identify, cultivate, and empower supporters through different channels? How do we make sure that we're talking in the right way to the right people at the right time, which extends to a value systems conversation around politics and around taxation and how government is structured. It extends to mission when you're talking to donors and folks who want to support your organization as a library. The practical side of it is, I think it's a very smart book. And Patrick is certainly the lead author on that. And we've seen the application of it in how we've grown as EveryLibrary from truly 0 people and $0. We didn't start the organization with anything in the bank. We did a crowdfunding round back in 2012. We asked the profession of librarianship, we asked the library community, if you think that we should have a political action committee focused on these issues, throw us some money, we'll put it to work, and we haven't stopped. The same way we had 0 people in our database. We did not bring a database in from any other source, and we said, I mean, I think Aaron Dobbs might have been the first guy who signed up. I don't know if you've been Aaron Dobbs here, but we said, if you want to be part of this, sign on to support, but more importantly, sign on and do something with your sign on. Because we've been directing people in support of outcomes at the ballot box, changes at the state government, God bless us, America, Congress, those kinds of actions have allowed people to participate. Then the book that I was more the lead on with Before the Ballot is a handbook for when you have to go to an election day. In some states, you're compelled every certain number of years, every 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, you have to renew your levy or your referendum. Some places you have the opportunity to go out once a year in a New York or a New England state where you've got the town hall meetings, Other places it might be once a generation. So those skills that are unique to that one day of the year, election day, is what we're trying to transmit in that book. And the idea here being that the conventional wisdom, we wrote them in, as you said, 2017, 2019. The conventional wisdom in the library sector has still not been disrupted adequately. The conventional wisdom about you put it on the ballot, people love libraries, they'll vote for you, was already starting to sunset by the time we got those books in play. What's changed since then? The Tea Party, the rise of the Tea Party and the anti-tax movement in 2008, 2009, 2010 was part of that drift away from automatic support for libraries and librarianship. That's been accelerated and exacerbated by the pandemic because we had necessarily had to close one of the few places that was true public service. And a lot of the anti-mask, anti-vaccine folks decided to cast a eye of Sauron at the library because it was a softer target. And then it has certainly been accelerated by the rise in the censorship campaigns and the rises in the discrimination campaigns. There's campaigns of erasure that are using book bans as a form of that weaponized attack against minority groups. The terroir in local communities is in some places it hasn't changed. Everybody still loves the library. Things are chill. Just don't screw it up. Right. But we tend to work as consultants and partners. We tend to work with the libraries that are having very complicated campaigns. We tend to work with about 10% of the libraries every year on the ballot. I go back to that book. I go back to both of those books quite frequently. What's the application in the current moment? It's about talking about your value system as a library and asking folks who should care, who likely care, if they care enough to spend the tax money. And to go back to the fundamentals of transparency and planning that are, the heart of a strategic plan should be the funding formula of it. Right. To go back to those principles, those first principles. I think if we wrote a second edition, and we've got some plans, we'll tell you about them later, but if we write a second edition, it's on the application of it in the current moment, as opposed to the fundamentals. Taxes make Americans crazy, and it's always been that way. Taxes made Americans crazy enough to do the Boston Tea Party. It's part of our DNA, Right. So how do we work within an environment where we can talk about taxes and also in an environment where the core value system of libraries around the diversity, equity, and inclusion of our collections is being attacked?
So let's pull it back. You talk a lot about funding and local sources. Let's look nationally. Given President Trump's second administration on the horizon, what new challenges do you see EveryLibrary getting involved in?
So the framework here is not a partisan conversation; it's a policy conversation.
Of course.
But I do want to say that out loud because right now, when we're working in communities, the message environment from a library tends to be very progressive. The librarians themselves are fairly progressive, and I'm not labeling us I'm looking at the data about things like in the 2020 presidential election, of all the librarians who donated to either candidate, 9 out of 10 of them donated to Biden. Okay. I'm not saying this from my own hunch. It's the survey work around
It's the data.
it's the data, you know. The progressive idiom resonates in either a hero mode or a villain mode with progressives. Okay, so we're heroes about how we provide access. The villain is to a progressive somebody who denies access. But there's a libertarian conversation around heroes and villains. There's a conservative version of that. If we want to use it as a proxy for party, that's great. I'm saying this is a nonpartisan conversation, even federally and nationally right now, because there's a fourth way that's come into force with this next Trump administration. The fourth way is that burn it all down to the ground approach to government. And I mean, I'm not into that personally. I mean, I run a political action committee and a think tank for libraries. I mean, I think that there's a role for a progressive tax policy that supports the common good. You know,
Right.
I like the First Amendment. I like the 14th Amendment too. And I'm a pretty big fan of the 10th these days also because it might be the thing that protects libraries in a next Trump administration. The conversation around what's the role of government in our lives is going to be played out in very aggressive ways by the next administration. Whether your listeners want to say that Project 2025 is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Trump campaign, or if they just want to look at the Agenda 47, which was the president-elect's own platform, they're calling for things that are fundamentally different than what librarianship looks like. And they're also calling for things in Project 2025 like the criminalization of libraries. So it's not, Maurice, there's some tactical things in here. What's the future of the Institute of Museum and Library Services, but also
Right.
the NEA and NEH and PBS. There's some very tactical things here in terms of what's the relationship between the federal government and how they protect rights, particularly the civil rights of readers. And you know, there's some very practical and tactical things here that that election was about philosophy of government. And it's a philosophy of government that I am nervous about going into force unchecked. So what we're going to try and do here at EveryLibrary is show up with integrity. You know, who's the legitimate local stakeholder? It's the American public. You know, who are the affected populations? It's library users and those who benefit from an educated and
Which, John, is the American public.
yeah. So I mean, it's not a partisan fight. It's a philosophical one that plays out in how laws are written and how budgets are allocated.
I'm going to take us a little bit towards entrepreneurship because
Okay.
I know, John, you're passionate about it. You've attended conferences, you've had discussions with Paul about it. And the reason I'm thinking about it personally is that my undergraduate degree is in business, and then I went to business school to get my MBA before I even became a librarian. And as I'm thinking, you know, and reflecting over the last 15 years at Chapman University, and I feel it just came to me naturally to be in library advocacy and fundraising because I had those tools that I learned in business school. But one of the questions that I was going to ask you is like, why don't we think about like what actually some of the libraries don't think about themselves as entrepreneur centers sometimes. How can entrepreneurial thinking, whether it's social entrepreneurship or business entrepreneurship, we should be teaching it in library school so it can help us in library fundraising and advocacy.
Yeah, I mean the starter mentality, and I did drag Paul along to was it a Rural Rise conference, Paul, that we did? I think it was
something in Detroit, and it was with the teens that were being encouraged to be entrepreneurs, and you and I were with the library viewpoint.
Yes, that was a great project, and unfortunately, from what I understand, it didn't come out the other side of the pandemic. So, yeah. That said, part of the reason to focus on entrepreneurship is to have an answer to the question of what else do you do besides help kids find fun books, you know? And honestly, the work that's being done in public libraries that is uncredited to the public library, that is unknown by starters and entrepreneurs and small businesses and big businesses. I got involved in the entrepreneurship side of librarianship mainly because of having a failed startup myself at the end of the dot-com era. I mentioned that in my little bio segment at the beginning. We failed on a Tuesday in February of 2001, and we had two things that were wrong with us. One is we had a bad sales model, and the other is we had bad informatics. And if I had a librarian in my life, I think I could have had some more intelligence about I mean, how much money did we spend? God bless them, on EBSCO and Gale and Clarivate and all those different databases. Those are market intelligence and business analytics tools. Those are things that help take an idea to market. How much time do we spend in public libraries bringing people together in hobby kind of contexts? There's a hobbyist to entrepreneur pipeline that everyone who does economic development should be like, yeah, I want in on that. Because what does a hobbyist to entrepreneurship pipeline look like? How do you find that person who wants to start the business? The framework of libraries as a systems support. Literacy makes sense. Early childhood makes sense. But entrepreneurship, the business community, all those kinds of wonderful things. And also, I got to be honest with you, this coming crisis period for libraries, we're going to have to come back and almost re-justify our existence to certain groups that are really looking at an ideal that is about what's the bottom line, what's the individual. Prosperity as a component of the civic conversation is something that I think libraries have been avoiding. We are contributors to the prosperity of communities. That's not a bad word.
I was going through my memory trying to remember the conference we were both talking about. It was Philadelphia, and I remember the guy that ran it was Gene. So anybody who's looking for that, it was somewhere around 2018, 2019. Just a wonderful exploration of the whole spirit of entrepreneurship, not just being about business, but about collaborations. In the spirit of trying to talk about something up in this situation and give some inspiration, can you tell us a couple of stories that have given you hope and inspiration at a time when challenges were threatening to take you down?
So because in a time of challenge, you think about what keeps you up at night. What am I worried about? What's heavy on my heart? What's on my mind? But the inspiration stuff is what gets you up in the morning. The opportunity for collaborations with people who've got great ideas. That's what gets me up in the morning. It might be a great idea about right to access materials, so we're going to fight censorship. It might be a great idea about co-locating library services. I got to be honest with you, Paul. The last couple of election cycles have been a lot of block and tackle. So the good things about doing block and tackle with good people certainly are cool. But I think about something like Spokane, Washington, the city of Spokane library there, where Karis O'Malley, and I don't remember Karis's job title. He used to be at Maricopa County before that in Arizona. Karis has done some amazing things right now with structuring the library's debt, which is kind of a funny thing to say, but how do you finance a good idea for a building? You got to figure out a way to do a mortgage or float a bond. What Karis has done, instead of doing the traditional bond package that has to go out and get voter approval and then go to New York and sell bonds and you have 30 years or whatever, Karis has done some extraordinary things. For example, with a enterprise zone nonprofit that is building mixed use housing. And how do you co-locate a library branch in that mixed-use housing development? Okay, the structure of that is particular to Washington and how they do enterprise zones. But his entrepreneurial spirit there is to say there's a challenge for the user base. There's an opportunity for the library. The systems that are currently in place aren't adequate to the task. How do we look outside, and then how do we apply a good solution to it, utilizing those kinds of new tools?
In San Francisco, we actually did that about 10 or 15 years ago. A local market in one of the smaller branch neighborhoods burned down, and the building that replaced it was the market back on the first floor, the library on the second floor, with a little bit of housing around it. So certainly far from impossible. Oh,
absolutely. No, these are some of the great ideas. I just got to work with that one in Spokane. The one in San Francisco is, that one has gotten, I think, some doctoral dissertations written about it. I think about the wins that we've had in places like the New Orleans campaign in a few years ago. The whole point of going to the ballot was to help make permanent in the tax base the services that they were doing using donor money. They had a giant project for multiple years with the United Way. And the United Way was like, okay, it's been 3 to 5 years, we're done. And they weren't being rude about it. That's how these things work. They had changed, they had impacted a lot of different humans' lives through social services, workforce supports, all kinds of good stuff. And how do you make sure that that gets permanent? Well, you run a political campaign to increase your tax rate so you can hire the people permanently who do that work and have that kind of stuff in place. Those sorts of approaches, Paul, are the thing that gets me up in the morning.
John, what are some basic coalition building techniques that libraries can use to build local, regional, and statewide support? They're not just talking public libraries, I'm talking academic libraries, special libraries, school libraries. Here are some quick things you can do to build that support.
Sure. So the rubric that we always approach any coalition from is the question, trying to answer the question of who else cares. Okay, who else cares?
I like that.
It's straightforward. Who else cares about what or about whom? Okay, so there's either people or place. And this goes for schools too, by the way, because like all these schools, they have the t-shirt that says college on it, it's Go Tigers, like the placemaking of those schools cannot be taken for granted. People or place, who else cares about those people? And what does it mean for a coalition for us to have the right resources to support those people properly? And I don't mean general populations exclusively, I mean specific populations. Those people who need a particular service, who else cares, is the natural pathway to coalitions that focus on funding or policy or the ability to do your jobs. Same thing with place. Who else cares about our hometown? Who else cares about our home state? Who else cares about the United States of America in the ways that we do as well? And that systems approach, what do they care about? Maybe it's a structure of government that allows for clean water, So all this environmental stuff and sustainability stuff we're doing in libraries, that has a natural coalition space that's way outside of our programmatic zone. I mean, unless we're doing like lead testing for water kits and whatever. I'm talking like what do they care about? They care about some of those same systems of law and public policy as we do. So whether it's a school environment, locally, it looks different than it does at the state level. It looks differently at the national level because of the nature of the contact point with those people and the proximity to that place. But the principles are the same. Who else cares like we do?
I like that. I have a question actually about boards. I have a love-hate relationship with boards.
Oh, you and me both. Let's go.
And I think everybody does, right? Like you love your board, but it's so hard to manage sometimes. You love your board, but sometimes it's really hard to recruit people to be on your board. So how were you able to pull a group of people together to work, be effective, and actually really participate, not just have their names on your board and say that I am just part of this?
Sure. So I do not have a love-hate relationship with my own board. I have a love-hate relationship with public library boards, sometimes having been on them. So let me just gloss that. Anybody who's watching this who's on my board currently, or you get a gold star.
Good. Kick save and a beauty, John. Kick save. Kick
Okay,
save
thank
and a
you.
beauty.
Yeah. Well, the reason I got a little bit love-hate relationship with public library boards is because over the years, library directors, not all of them, but many of them, have driven down the involvement of their library boards to the point where the library board's responsibility is not fiduciary to the taxpayer or policy to the citizenry. It's about acquiescing sometimes to what the library director wants. And so they've abrogated their responsibilities as board members. Their only job is to establish a quorum and say yes. That's my hate problem. A good public library is going to matter. Organizationally, for EveryLibrary, the first thing I did was I promised everybody that I brought into the EveryLibrary board or the EveryLibrary Institute board, again, separate legal organizations with two separate boards. I promised them we will never have a committee. We will never do a committee. What we're going to do is we're going to come together as adults and talk about the big ideas. And we will have folks from public library, school library, academic library, special library, and outside of our industry to talk about these ideas and ask each other. So the way that I think that boards can be most effective is utilizing a Chicago-based method of giving advice. And those of you who've heard me say this before, my apologies, but in Chicago, we give advice in two ways. We say, I got a guy, or if I was you. Okay. So, oh, Maurice, you got a problem with your plumbing.
I got a guy.
Yeah. Or I say, Maurice, if I was you, I would scrap that whole thing and move on, That's what a good board does. A good board says, if I was you, John, as the CEO, as the executive director, if I was you, I would pursue these particular initiatives, or I'd stop doing that other thing. John, if I was you, because that's what I want to know. I want these smart people to tell me, okay? And then occasionally, it's the I got a guy, or I got a gal, to be able to say to these people, can you help me out in your domain? Okay, I brought you into this thing because you know people I don't know. You're smarter than me about some of this stuff, and we've been collaborators before in other contexts. So the combination of those two things allows for, I think, an abundance approach rather than a scarcity approach. And no committee services means that you don't have to be bogged down in 1950s governance models. And we don't need a 1950s governance model in 2012, let alone 2024.
John, what's one of your favorite success stories in terms of advocating for libraries and the communities they serve?
That's a hard one. It's 13 years of work, and it's a couple hundred, different activities. The one I love to bring up the most, though, get the Miami campaign where we got the mayor to turn around from trying to cut the library's budget by $12 million to help turn that around with a lot of local stakeholders, the Friends organization there, even Knight Foundation showed up. We ended up, the county council there added $8 million instead, The New Orleans campaign, which I mentioned before, there's great things up on the big board. But the one that I come back to a lot is Potomac, Illinois. Potomac, Illinois was on the ballot. Potomac, Illinois has 646 people who live there. It's on Illinois 1, not US 1. Illinois 1. It's a school district basically. I'm not sure why it's a library district. At some point or another, they made one. 646 people. They wanted to set it up a tax measure that would that could bring in a youth services librarian and they could fix the roof. It's the only infrastructure in that community. It's literally the only thing there. Some towns that we work with, the library is the only thing on Main Street besides the post office, an antique store, and a Chinese restaurant. The infrastructure that we're helping to support. But that Potomac, Illinois was the smallest town we've ever worked in. I don't know how we can get any smaller, and they haven't needed any help since then, which is really edifying.
That's great. So John, as you're speaking about all the work that your organization does and the things that you're involved in, especially the political organizing, I think this is really exhausting work, physically and mentally, and just thinking about it every day. So what do you do to take care of yourself, like your own health, wellness? What are some of your practices?
I am not a good example of good practices at all. I'm a terrible human when it comes to this kind of self-care stuff. And I flippantly said, about the more work. I'm not trying to suggest that anybody should follow my lead. It's everyone's got their own personal mojo. I don't have good advice for anybody that's healthy. I don't.
And maybe I was actually listening to a podcast this morning as I was dropping off my daughter to school. And then there was this guy, I can't remember his name, but he said, I don't believe in work-life balance. So but he's happy. So as long as you're happy, maybe that's your form, maybe more work is your form of balancing things out.
The thing about it is, so I was interviewing Maya Wiley. She is the CEO of the one of the big civil rights organizations, and I can't remember the formal name, and I'll send it to you so you can put it in the notes. Her parents were civil rights organizers in the 60s. She grew up in a home that was where people came to organize, nationally and locally. And it was a wonderful interview. She actually ran for mayor of New York a couple of years ago. And it was a great interview. Her memoir came out. I was reading her memoir, and it was all about how, she as a child, there's people who remember her as a child who are household names. They're on our money now, like this is, and I said to her in the introduction, I said, my family, we have a political action committee for libraries. We have a nonprofit public policy think tank. My wife has set up a local political action committee to run candidates for school board. She's an elected official. She's on the school board. She was on the school board during pandemic. I was on the library board. My dad was the zoning board president. And I asked her point blank, I said, am I going to screw up my kids, or are they going to be okay like you? And really, Essraa, that's my only concern, is the work-life balance, issue keeping me away, too much. And and my kids keep telling me it's all right, Dad, so that's about all I got for you.
I've got to say, working with you when we did stuff together at ALA was always inspiring. Watching you at EveryLibrary, working with you and Patrick remains inspiring. And spending time with you today has been the same way. Hope that's true of the people watching this. I hope that what their takeaway is let's do something with this instead of just watching it. So again, thank you very much.
Paul, it's been a real pleasure to have this conversation with you, Maurice, Essraa. It's a real treat to be here today. Thank you for asking me questions about myself. There's nothing more that I like to talk about.
And thank you all for joining us. And thanks to the San José State University iSchool. Information Gone Wild's guests come from traditional and non-traditional information organizations like EveryLibrary. We invite them and invite you to share insights and adventures from the field with us, along with what inspires their work.
Join us next time for the Information Gone Wild podcast, where we discuss all things information science. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel to make sure you don't miss the next episode. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.